lot of information, a lot of stories, a lot of ways in which he is a picture for us of Jesus Christ and what Jesus does for us. And as with so much of the Old Testament, the better you understand the Old Testament, the better you'll understand, the deeper you will understand the New Testament. And I think Moses is certainly that way. The better we understand him, the more we understand his role in God's plan, the more connections we're going to see to Jesus, the more depth we're going to see in the gospel. So anyway, I'm very excited to spend this time thinking about this with you. Another, kind of just point as we get into the introduction, he makes several good points. I do think we're going to have some good discussion this morning. But one of the main things I want us to keep in mind as we're studying this character and as we're looking at these stories is, remember, this was a real man who really lived. This is a real man who really lived. And it's easy to lose sight of that when you skip to Exodus 12 or whatever, you skip to Deuteronomy and you're reading the specific stories, Numbers, the specific stories about Moses. And it's easy to just kind of think about him in a snapshot of time and what he did there. This study, I think, very powerfully will help us to try to zoom out and think about the man as a whole. Think about how he got to that point where that story happened. Think about how he grew to the point where he could be that man in that story. And I feel like that's so profitable for myself. I think it'd be profitable for all of us because we have a tendency, I know I have a tendency to think about what I need to be doing in the kingdom, what I need to be doing in the service, and constantly feeling like I'm not up to the task. Constantly feeling like I'm not the man. I can't do this. And the reality is that God always asks things of people that are more than they thought they could do. He always asks more of people than what they thought they could do. And Moses is a great example of that. And he had to grow to the point. He had to grow to the point that he could be the man who led them out of Egypt. That's important to think about. He had to grow to the point where he could mediate for them on God's behalf. He had to grow to the point where he could stand up to the rebellions in the wilderness. God, this is overused phrase, but God has a plan for you. God wants you. His plan, I don't think, is a specific plan, but for us as individuals, but he has plans for us to be fruitful in his kingdom. He wants us all to be fruitful in his kingdom, and we all need to be challenging ourselves. And as we challenge ourselves, a lot of times we're going to run into what we feel like is a brick wall and think, I can't do this. I can't do this. And certainly we know Moses felt that way at different times. And so this, to me, is a challenge for us to grow, to try to push ourselves beyond what we're normally comfortable with, to try to bear more fruit. The language in John 15 that I'm alluding to, if a branch doesn't bear fruit, what happens? Cut off. If a branch does bear fruit, what happens? It gets pruned so it can bear more fruit. Well, if you're not bearing fruit, shame on you. If I'm not, shame on me. We need to bear fruit. If you are bearing fruit, wonderful. God's going to try to prune you so you can bear more. He doesn't want us to get complacent. He doesn't want us to stop growing. So I think Moses overall is just an amazing example of that. A lot of Bible characters are amazing examples of that. All right, so where I'm going to be at on this slide, and I didn't want to go through and kind of click point by point, but we are going to be going through the content of the introduction. The content from this comes from primarily page 5 in your workbooks. And I'm going to be using some of the language in the book. This is one of the reasons why I'm feeling a little bit awkward preaching or teaching out of the book. But a very poetic statement there in the beginning. Does anybody need a book, by the way? Would you mind, Jeremiah? Thank you for that. Yeah. Sorry about that. Sorry. Yeah. I'm on page 5 of the workbook. the very, very poetic statement right there in the beginning, and he doesn't attribute it to anyone, although it's in quote marks. He says, between the bulrushes in the Nile and an unmarked grave on Nebo stands the portrait of a man unmatched in human history. The portrait of a man unmatched in human history. And that, again, very poetic way of thinking about that, from his birth and his placement in the Nile to then the unmarked grave on Mount Nebo, or wherever it was. Nobody really knows, I guess. God knows. Moses is a very unique figure. He's a very unique person. One of the things that was noted in here is, unlike most Bible characters, we have Moses' life recorded, obviously with a lot of gaps, but we have his life recorded from birth to death. We have the whole picture of his life from beginning to end. There's a few other characters that you could say that with, but not very many. Not very many. Jesus obviously being one. Here in the, again, same page, it says it's impossible to overemphasize the importance of Moses in the unfolding of God's plan for the redemption of man. And that, I certainly think that that's true, to recognize how important Moses was in the unfolding of God's plan. In fact, as you get down toward the end of this page, he makes the point, all themes, this is the second one from the bottom, all themes of subsequent prophets constantly return to the message of Moses. They're always returning to the message of Moses. They're always referencing Moses. Rhodes just did a great class for us going through the return from exile, Ezra and Nehemiah, that period. And that's constantly what they're trying to do, is get back to the law of Moses, get back to those teachings, get back to what we refer to as the Old Covenant. So really the rest of the Old Testament, all of the Old Testament from this point on, is going to be referencing back to these commands, referencing back to Sinai. And so again, it's a very important thing to remember. Also, even just the Exodus. The Exodus from Egypt, which Terry a couple years ago did pretty detailed analysis of some of the history around the Exodus. The prophets, the writings of the Old Testament are constantly referencing back to that. It's that kind of that linchpin point, that center point, keystone point, where the prophets point back to think about what God did for them and how He planted them in this land. It all starts with Exodus. It all starts right here. It's very, very powerful. You also could just think about how our Bibles are laid out. Obviously the first five books are attributed to Moses. They're attributed to his authorship. And it's kind of interesting because you get into the very end of Deuteronomy and it tells about his death. And there never was there a prophet like this. And you're like, well, how did he write that? So I do think that there's probably, almost certainly, someone else who penned the end of that. And it's possible that some of Deuteronomy, or a good bit of Deuteronomy, maybe was penned by somebody else. But in Jewish history, Jewish tradition, Moses is attributed the authorship of these books. And we don't have really any reason, other than what I just mentioned, to try to deviate from that. And even if we did deviate from it and said, well, it had to be somebody else, well, who would we say? I mean, who would it be? And what difference does it make is the other point that I would get to, is these books are treated as the revelation of God. They're treated as the books of Moses. He's given attributed authorship for them, and that's how I'm going to treat them. That's how I'm going to treat them. Again, I just feel like I'm lecturing, so if somebody wants to interrupt, please jump in. I really appreciated his point about how Moses is the personification of law. The personification of law. Think about how often the law of Moses is referred to. The law of Moses. It was the law that was revealed through Moses, and not just the Ten Commandments. A lot of times people will kind of stop there, just think about the Ten Commandments, but it's all of the law, all of the regulations and requirements that were revealed And again, as the prophets are pointing back to that, that's how it's referred to, the law of Moses. More often than not, we refer to it as the Old Testament, but in the Bible, it's referred to as the law of Moses. So think about the fact that his name is synonymous. His name is forever linked with this covenant. I mean, completely and totally linked with this covenant. That's very significant. When you get to how Moses is referred to in the New Testament and how he parallels Jesus Christ, there's a lot of roles. We'll get to kind of the different hats that Moses wears, but one of his primary roles is that of lawgiver. And this is one of those things you think about it. Of course, he had a neat quote in here. He says, Moses stands as the personification of law, while Jesus personifies the contrast of grace. And I think there's an element in which that's true. I do think sometimes that's overstated. God has always wanted our heart. God has always been a God of love. Sometimes when people are looking back at the Old Testament, they say, well, the Old Testament doesn't have grace. The Old Testament God is not a God of love. Not right. That's not right. It's the same God. He was always a God of grace. Read the Psalms and try to take out love and grace from the Psalms. You can't do it. You can't do it. Nevertheless, and I'm thinking about reading Romans. When you read Romans and he's talking about the law, he's more often than not, he's talking about the law of Moses. The law of Moses. And that, as it's pictured in Romans, was a law of requirements. It was a law that these things need to be kept. And as Hebrews says, there's no provision for failure. There's no provision for failure because the blood of bulls and goats could never take away sins. And they didn't fully understand that the way we understand it, the way we and not that we're better than them, let's be careful. We only fully understand it because it's been revealed to us that Christ's blood is the perfect sacrifice. Christ's blood is what makes the difference. But I don't think people living under the law of Moses, people living in the old covenant, I don't think they would have thought about there not being any forgiveness, there not being any grace. I think that's important for us to know. They were offered forgiveness through the sacrifices. They didn't understand that ultimately it was going to be tied into Jesus' sacrifice, but that didn't mean that they didn't have a concept of forgiveness and mercy. Yes, sir?
Just read about it. A good example is us as father kids. When they're young and they do something wrong, you're going to spank them, give them whoopings, but you still love them. But when Macy's her age right now and she does something wrong, I'm not going to give her a whooping. I'm going to just point it out, talk to her about it. Shame. I love her. I love my kids at a young age when I'm whooping them, and I love them when they're older. That's kind of like the Old Testament. That's right. Versus now.
I think that's a really good way of looking at it. I'm going to quote you on the whooping. Yes, sir.
I kind of read it a little bit different. When I get the idea of a personification is that it's the concept is embedded in the person. And I think about when I was reading, I was thinking about Titus, where he says the grace of God has appeared, bringing salvation to all men. There, he's using the grace as really a pronoun for Christ, because in the context when it goes through, it's not just God's grace came, it was through Christ. And that when we talk about the coming of Christ, it is it's not just because of grace, but he's the representative of grace. And then when I think about the personification of law, I thought about the rich man and Lazarus, where the rich man says, send Lazarus back. And he says, no, they have Moses and the prophets, not the law of Moses and the prophets, but in saying the name Moses, it encompassed all of that law. That's why I took that. You could just say, well, according to Moses, and it's not according to the man, it's according to the law that was given by God.
I think that's exactly right, and I appreciate you saying it the way you did. I want us to be careful about separating grace and forgiveness from the Old Testament, because I think that's a mistake, but I don't disagree with you. Thank you for that. Absolutely. see. Any other thoughts on this slide? And this is really page 5 in your workbooks. Let's move on just a little bit here. This information comes from page 6 almost exclusively. He's got the section here, designations of Moses, and then the roles of Moses. I want to talk about that for a minute. Obviously, as we get into the stories and we get into his life, we're going to see why these roles are attributed to him, why these designations are given to him. So I don't want to get too caught in the weeds on all of this, but I thought it was really powerful to see this all together. In Deuteronomy 5 and Psalm 105, you see Moses referred to as the servant of God, which, is not the only person referred to in that way, but it's a beautiful thing to be said about anyone. In Psalm 106, he's referred to as the chosen one, which, if you ask most of us, who's God's chosen one? Jesus. Jesus is the chosen one. Moses is referred to as the chosen one, specifically in the context of leading them out of Egypt. He was the chosen one to do that. But again, that's a neat kind of marker to think about. Several places he's referred to as the man of God. That one in Ezra 3 and verse 2, again, connects to the lesson we had through Rhodes recently. But they're trying to get back to the law of Moses. They're trying to get back in to understanding that covenant. And it refers to him there as Moses, the man of God, which is, again, very powerful. And then I think very unique to Moses, you see him referred to as a friend of God, the friend of God in Exodus 33 and verse 11. That's on the bottom of this slide. Moses used to speak, the Lord used to speak to Moses face to face as a man speaks to his friend. So, that's really the biggest difference between Moses and any of the other prophets that you see in the Old Testament is God spoke to him differently. God spoke to him differently. And, you could say, well, wait a minute. Remember the story where Moses couldn't see God's face? Remember, he couldn't see his face and live, so God had to put him in the cleft of the rock, put his hand over him as he passed by. He saw his back, so he couldn't see him face to face. That's not the point. The point is God spoke to him directly. He spoke to him as a friend speaks to a friend face to face. Like if I want to go to Frankie, a lot of y'all know I'm not much for talking on the phone. If I had something to talk to Frankie about, I'd go to him where I could see his face and interact with him directly. And that's this. That's how God spoke with Moses. That's how he interacted with Moses, which is really amazing. It is really amazing to think about. We can come back on any of that as we're discussing here. So I've got up here, this is his list, again, page 6 in your workbook, of the roles that are attributed to Moses. And these roles are not from Scripture. These roles are well, I say how you think about it, but they're a man's interpretation. They're men's interpretation of who Moses was. For instance, author and historian. I mean, he's referred to as authoring these books, never called a historian. So we're taking that and calling him that off of what we see. But as you look at this list, I guess one, are there any comments or things to say about them? Do any of these stand out as being odd or awkward or not fitting or just something else to say about any of these? There's at least one that kind of stood out to me. It's like, wait a minute. I never would have put that there. Is there? Statesman, okay. Yeah, statesman stood out to me too. I think statesman and even patriot kind of connect together. And I think I'm not sure I'd be in complete agreement with attributing those terms.
I'd like to know what the author
Right, sort of, yeah. Nah.
Patriot is someone who believes deeply in a nation.
Yeah.
You believe deeply in the Israelite.
Yeah.
So that would apply, but I don't know what you consider as
well, and I think part of the history of the Exodus is taking a people. They had been turned into a great people, but they were not a nation. They had no real nationality until they took root in the land of Canaan, until they took root in the promised land. But I mean, from another standpoint, you say, well, he did make of them a great nation in Egypt. He did make them a great nation, but they didn't get their identity until they got out. He's almost like a kind of a founding father in that way. And they're like, okay, all right, statesman, patriot, all right, that fits. But again, to Jeremiah's point, you got to define your terms and really think about in what way he was those things. Thinking about his, did you have a hand, Steve? Sorry.
Going back to one of the first points, he is a real man.
Yes, sir.
And we look at this and we read it, this is a man that wrote these things nearly 4,000 years ago. You know what I mean? And we're looking into who he was 4,000 years ago.
It's pretty awesome,
And
isn't it?
yes, it makes us realize how important it is.
Yes, sir. Yeah. Especially through the lens of faith that we all have, that Moses was who he was because God chose him. He was who he was because God held his hand and helped him become that. And we have this record because God wanted us to have this record. So it's not an accident. That makes it even more awesome than just reading a neat story.
We're looking at a Bible. We didn't take yesterday.
Yeah, that's right.
It's, yeah. We have evidence in things like solar.
The one that stood out to me in this list was orator. I was like, wait a minute. He said he couldn't speak. He said, like, what, was that just an excuse? Remember in that exchange at the burning bush, God tells him, God actually makes concession for that excuse. And he says, well, I'll let Aaron. Aaron will be your mouthpiece. And so a lot of times after that point, when it talked about Moses said to Pharaoh, I think we kind of need to understand that that's probably Moses speaking to Pharaoh through Aaron, as Aaron is the mouthpiece. Yes, sir.
Kind of touched on it. You can be insecure in what you're talking about, or what. Obviously, Moses had insecurities when the Lord came to him. But if you look over the years and how he grew to be the man that you're talking about, he became, then that working part may have subsided.
Or, maybe when he was 40 years old, Prince of Egypt, maybe he was, and then the wilderness humbles him to the point where he's like, I can't do that anymore. I can't be that guy anymore. But to Darren's point, I think he grew out of that. I think he grew from that feeling of inadequacy.
Well, I just think Deuteronomy is a series of sermons like that.
Yeah.
He became an orator whether he didn't think he was at the beginning or not. Yeah.
Isn't that powerful to think about? I love that. Absolutely. I think as we get into those stories, we'll see more of that.
It's practical for us because we do, like you said, feel like we're inadequate. So we continue to grow. We can become what we want
To become what God needs us to be. I mean, how often, I've got several stories in my mind of men who I know who said, well, I can't do that, and I can't do that. And then years go by and you see them grow into that. You see them do something that they didn't think they could do. And that's awesome to see. That's awesome to see. One I wanted to comment on, too, was emancipator, which obviously he was. I mean, he led them free from captivity. That's one of the defining things about Moses. I was watching the old Charlton Heston movie with some of my kids just a week or two back. And it never stood out to me before, but in that movie, the fact that he was the emancipator was front and center. I mean, that was the main thing. And they make this big thing about no man should be in slavery. No man should be in captivity. And I was like, that's not the message of Exodus. I want to make that point. God in the Old Covenant allowed for a form of slavery. He allowed for a form of slavery. So, Moses wasn't, as that movie pictures it, Moses wasn't this complete abolitionist. That wasn't what was on the table for discussion. He was trying to free the Israelites from Egyptian captivity. He was trying to free them. So he was an emancipator of that race. But I think thinking of him beyond that may be a mistake, or we're taking our our modern perspective and trying to project it onto him. I don't think that fits. We need to be careful about doing that. Thoughts, comments, questions, concerns? I see some chuckles. Did I miss something? Did I say something bad? All right. What about judge and priest? We don't oftentimes think about Moses as a priest. Psalm there is at 99 refers to him and Aaron as part of the priesthood. I think we can see allusion to that in Hebrews as well. So that's neat to think about. That's pretty powerful to think about. Him as a judge, usually when we think about judges, we kind of skip forward in the timeline to the period of the judges, but maybe helpful to think about that the period of the judges, the stage for the period of the judges was set by the way Joshua behaved himself as a leader and the way Moses behaved himself as a leader. And we can see this story here, the neat story where his father-in-law comes out and he sees how Moses is trying to judge every little thing in this whole nation. And his father-in-law gives him some advice of how to, delegate, thank you, how to delegate the authority of all these judgments so that it wouldn't all rest on his shoulders. But I think the indication is before that, it was all resting on his shoulders. And even after that, as part of that advice, was that Moses would judge the larger matters. He would judge the more difficult matters. So completely appropriate to think about him in the judge role, which sometimes we don't see. Any other thoughts, comments about that list? Obviously, as we get into different stories, specific stories, we'll be building on some of that. We've already talked about these lessons in faith, growing through a series of trials. The content for this slide comes primarily from page 6 and 7 in your workbook. And we've talked about this, him growing through the series of trials. The author actually used the phrase that Moses was made perfect through suffering, which is, straight out of Philippians. Jesus was made perfect through suffering. Moses, as a type of that, is perfected through suffering. Very, very powerful to see that, I think. With a lot of what Darren was commenting earlier, some of my introduction thoughts is as him growing through a series of trials, and even the period in Midian, 40 years in Midian, we can see that as a period of growth. He comes out of Midian a different man, in a lot of ways humbled, almost broken, and then has to be rebuilt into the man that God needs him to be, which, isn't that us too? I mean, at age 40, he thought he was everything that he needed to be to lead the people. At least that's the indication, I think. That's the indication I get. And he wasn't what God needed him to be. And so he goes into the wilderness for 40 years and is humbled and then grows into the man that God needs him to be. That's a beautiful picture, I think. I didn't necessarily agree with the wording on all these points. I just thought to throw that out there. To me, in the wording of some of his points, he gives some commentary that I'm not sure is completely justified. So let me just throw out there. He says, hastiness in slaying the Egyptians. And in fact, in the book, it says hastiness and unjustifiable violence in slaying the Egyptian. Is it fair to assume that Moses was unjustified in slaying the Egyptian? No, the Bible doesn't tell us that, does it? I mean,
Institutes laws later that shows that there needs to be a process, not a trial, but a process given to someone before their sentence.
Yeah.
And so maybe it violates a principle that's shown later, but I mean, is it justifiable that just because he was doing something, that the Egyptian was doing something that Moses didn't appreciate, and none of us would, that it's death sentence administered by one man, and it kind of takes it on.
And I'm not trying to say that it wasn't, I'm just saying
The Bible doesn't explicitly say
it doesn't explicitly say it. And so to me, we need to be careful about that. At times, God actually instructs violence specific to his nation becoming what it needs to be. And I think in this moment, Moses was ready to be the leader. He was ready to lead them out of Egypt, and in his view, this violence was necessary to protect his people. I could envision him thinking of this as very much a self-defense, or at least a saving of another individual, and that it might have been justified in his eyes. I
think, though, he kind of explains it 12. He looked this way and that, and seeing no one,
Yeah.
he struck down the Egyptian and then hit him in the sand. I think
Yeah.
Moses knew what he was doing
Yeah.
wasn't
So it
right.
wasn't really hasty then, was it?
No,
It was
he
premeditated.
he made sure that nobody was or he thought nobody was witnessing.
Yeah. That's a great point. And tried to hide it. Yes, sir. Go ahead.
Maybe he's just talking about the point that Moses did this quickly,
Yeah.
okay? Just the hastiness, with the haste of doing it, thought he was maybe doing God's will. I don't know. We know it wasn't because God had another plan to deliver. But maybe that's what it, it's easy to get tied up in words and not necessarily understand the point.
And that's my only point about this, is he gives some commentary in there that I think we do need to be careful with. Jeff and then Jeremiah.
You go to Acts chapter 7, it says that, verse 24, and seeing one of them suffer wrong, he defended and avenged him who was oppressed, struck down the Egyptian. For he supposed that his brethren would have understood that God would deliver them by his hand, but they did not understand.
That's the point I wanted to develop, is, to me, yes, there is haste in this. Yes, he does it covertly, but you could say, well, the covertness is because he doesn't want the Egyptian government to rain down on him. But as that verse reads, it sounds like he's trying to be the deliverer. He's trying to be the deliverer, and he doesn't realize it's not God's time, or maybe it could have been God's time if the people would have reacted differently. As you read that, it sounds like it was almost the people's fault more than it was Moses' fault.
Well, that was my thought. I feel like maybe he's trying to take it upon himself,
Yeah.
because he's the man,
Yeah.
but it's not God's time.
That's right.
He needed to go through those 40 years.
That's right. That's right. And how often is that, sometimes the thing that we're doing might need to be done, but the timing is not right, and, we're prevented for whatever reason, and then comes back around and it happens in another way, in a different way.
And doing it like it was done, it gives God all the glory, rather than Moses get the glory 40 years.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a good point.
Well, I just to elaborate on my comments earlier, maybe the violence wasn't unjustifiable. It was the slaying that I was trying to say was unjustifiable. And to the point, like, when you don't wait, Abraham had the same problem, right? He wanted to do it on his timing, on his plan, and God's like, no, it's coming, and I'm gonna do it the way I wanna do it. And it was still a mistake to do what he thought.
Well, the way he reads, or the way the book reads, he says his foolish assumption of authority over his brethren. And I took the commentary out of that, the foolish assumption, because, as you read in Acts 7, it doesn't sound foolish. It sounds like what he was trying to do was maybe exactly the right thing, but the brethren, his people, weren't ready for it yet. So let's just kind of be careful about.
Always plays
Yeah.
God's power.
That's right. That's right.
How could they not know it?
Yeah.
And they were still not accepted.
And they still, even some of them,
Like talking about Acts, Jeff read.
Some of these in this list that I hadn't really meditated on before was the circumcision of his son. There's only two, is it 3 verses about that. And, we'll talk some more about it when we get there, but I hadn't thought about that as being a mistake or a failing of his. But if you think about it, he knew that Hebrews were supposed to be circumcised. That was a covenant that was given to Abraham. He should have known that. And while he's in the land of Midian, I'm assuming a little bit here, but what difference does it make? I'm never going to see my people again. I'm never going to be a part of that life again. So he doesn't do it. And I'm assuming a little bit, but he doesn't do it until at this point in the story, God sent him back to Egypt. And again, I'm assuming, but when going back to Egypt, he knows I'm going to be around my people again, and this is going to matter. Well, yeah, loses her temper a little bit at him. But it seems to me like she's more upset about the fact that the circumcision is necessary more than the fact that the circumcision hadn't happened yet. Because from her perspective, initially, Midianite, what does she care about circumcision? But now at this point in the timeline, all of a sudden Moses cares, whereas before he hadn't cared.
Well, I think maybe kind of putting yourselves into a Jewish perspective, I think that when we get to the judges, the fact that Deborah was a judge should have been shameful because no man was stepping up, and so God had to use a woman because that was not something, a role that women should have played. And so I felt like this account where Zipporah does it was a shameful thing that's not, Moses should have done it. And so she has to resort to doing it, and I think this is a great conversation.
Let's meditate on that and come back to it when we get to it in the timeline. And also the other thing, the second from the bottom of that list, his reaction to Pharaoh's first refusal. I don't know that I'd ever thought about that before, but I went back and read it, and at the initial refusal, when Moses comes and he throws his stick down, it becomes a snake, and he says, "Let my people go," and Pharaoh refuses, and you remember what he does as part of the refusal. He says, "By the way, y'all try to figure out how to make bricks without straw. Do that for a little while and see how that works." And Moses goes away from that broken, and he says, "Why did you send me here to bring this calamity on the people?" I mean, in that initial rejection of Pharaoh, Moses is despairing. And he gets over it, and you don't see that again. At least I didn't see it again as you read through the rest of the plagues. But he felt responsible. Think about it. Here I came to lead these people out, and you sent me, God. You sent me to lead these people out, and all I've done is brought extra heartache on them. And that reaction is completely natural, but it also shows a lack of faith, because God had explained all this to him. He had told him, there's going to be a period of works that I'm going to have to do to soften Pharaoh.
Verse 22, he says, "O Lord, why have you brought on me this people?" So I think that may have been like Hebrew response, because, "Oh my God, why have you forsaken me?" The psalmist knows that God has not forsaken him. He's expressing his feelings. So I never would have, I think you're saying, I never would have attributed that as a failure of Moses's. I think he's airing out his emotions, now, albeit in a very accusatory tone.
And it does feel like a lack of faith to me, and some of that might be some assumption. We need to be careful. I'm asking us to be careful about seeing commentary within the book. Let's be careful about attributing commentary too, and try to kind of think about where it could be coming from. But yeah, great thoughts. So I'm looking forward to all of this discussion. Just real quickly, because we're running out of time, breakdown on Moses' life. The book has these same 40-year periods. This is at the bottom of page 7. He's 40 years old when he flees Egypt. He's 40 years old when he gets called to go back to Egypt. And then he's 80 years old when he's called to go back to Egypt. And then he's 120 years old when he dies on Mount Nebo. So you see 3 40-year periods of his life. God's amazing, isn't he? God is so amazing when you see order like that within a man's life, within a man's story. The book didn't have the verse references on there. I'll put them up there for you if you want those verse references. They're right there. There's a pretty good discussion on page 8 about the dating of the Exodus, the dating of Moses' life. I'm not going to get into that. Terry got into that a little bit. It's interesting. It's interesting from at least a couple standpoints that, what was, I think, kind of commonly agreed to maybe 30 or 40 years ago. There's kind of another school of thought on it now that maybe that is a little bit later than what we used to think. But regardless, it doesn't change the stories that we're going to be talking about. It doesn't change the reality, the lessons that we can learn from them. It is neat to go through and see how Bible history interacts with known world history, but that's not going to be the focus of this class. Terry did some of that a few years ago, and we could do that again sometime, but I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. So just real quickly, the book points out into that Acts chapter 7 account, where in Stephen's sermon he refers to Moses, and he links Moses in that context with all the other rejected prophets and all the other rejected messengers. Jesus did the same thing. Jesus did the same thing in talking about the rejected messengers of God, and Moses is linked right in there with that. And we'll see that over and over again. He's dealing with being rejected. He's dealing with rebellion and all of it. Even Aaron and Miriam rebel against him and are ready to overthrow him. It's amazing to me that happens after everything that they saw. But so that's kind of the way he was treated during his life. And then, of course, you see God's analysis of it. In Deuteronomy 34, he says, there is not arisen a prophet in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face, none like him for all the signs and wonders that the Lord sent him to do in the land of Egypt. That's how God felt about Moses. And we make the point, Jesus makes the point for us, beware when people speak highly of you. Beware when people approve of you and pat you on the back. Moses in many ways was rejected and faced all kinds of pain, but he was approved by God. He was appreciated by God. So that's a great thing for us to remember. So we'll be moving into chapter 2, lesson 2 in your workbooks. If you're going to be with us in this class Sunday mornings, go ahead and grab a book. We've got a few extras. We'll get more if we need to. So lesson 2 next week. We've got about a 10-12 minute break before our worship hour, so we'll pause there now.
Moving now.